Welcome to Just Stories. We hope you enjoy the story. The Soviet-Afghan Conflict, A Decade of War and Turmoil, by Just Stories. Chapter 1, Invasion and Occupation. The Soviet Union enters Afghanistan. On December 24, 1979, the Soviet Union launched a full-scale invasion of Afghanistan, marking the beginning of a decade-long conflict that would have profound consequences for both Afghanistan and the Soviet Union. In this chapter, we will examine the factors that led to the Soviet Union's decision to invade Afghanistan, the early stages of the occupation, and the initial responses from the Afghan government and people. The roots of the conflict. The Soviet Union's decision to invade Afghanistan did not occur in a vacuum. For years, Afghanistan had been plagued by political instability and violence, with various factions vying for power and control over the country. In 1978, a left-wing military coup known as the Soviet Revolution brought the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan to power. The PDPA implemented a series of socialist reforms, but faced opposition from various groups, including traditionalists, Islamists, and tribal leaders. The Soviet Union had long been a supporter of the PDPA, providing aid and military support to the government. However, as the situation in Afghanistan deteriorated, the Soviet leadership grew increasingly concerned about the possibility of a pro-Western government coming to power. In addition, the Soviet Union saw Afghanistan as a strategic location that could help protect its southern border and expand its sphere of influence in the region. The invasion. On December 24, 1979, Soviet troops began pouring into Afghanistan, crossing the border from the north and taking control of key locations throughout the country. The invasion was swift and well-coordinated, with Soviet tanks and troops quickly overpowering Afghan defenses. Within a matter of days, the Soviet Union had installed a new government led by Babrak Karmal, a former PDPA official who was more favorable to Soviet interests. The Afghan response. The Soviet invasion was met with widespread opposition from the Afghan government and people. Many saw it as a violation of Afghanistan's sovereignty and an attempt to impose Soviet-style communism on the country. The new government was seen as illegitimate by many, and the opposition quickly coalesced into a broad-based resistance movement that would come to be known as the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen were initially made up of a loose coalition of tribal leaders, Islamists, and other groups opposed to the Soviet occupation. They launched a guerrilla war against Soviet troops, using hit-and-run tactics and taking advantage of their knowledge of the rugged terrain. The Mujahideen also received support from neighboring countries such as Pakistan, which provided them with weapons, training, and safe havens. Conclusion. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was a pivotal moment in the country's history, marking the beginning of a decade-long conflict that would have far-reaching consequences for Afghanistan, the Soviet Union, and the world. While the Soviet Union initially enjoyed military success in Afghanistan, they faced a determined and resourceful opposition that would ultimately wear them down. The invasion and occupation would ultimately cost the Soviet Union thousands of lives and billions of dollars, contributing to the country's economic and political decline. Chapter 2, Resistance and Insurgencies. The Mujahideen and their allies. In response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, a diverse coalition of groups emerged to resist the occupation. Known collectively as the Mujahideen, these groups employed a range of tactics and strategies to challenge Soviet control of the country. In this chapter, we will explore the origins and evolution of the Mujahideen, their ideology and tactics, and the international support they received in their fight against the Soviet Union. Origins of the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen were not a unified group, but rather a collection of factions with different goals and ideologies. Some were Islamist groups seeking to establish an Islamic state in Afghanistan, while others were nationalist groups seeking to expel the Soviet Union from the country. Still others were tribal militias, fighting to protect their communities from the violence and instability that had gripped the country. One of the most prominent Mujahideen leaders was Ahmad Shah Massoud, a Tajik commander who played a key role in the resistance effort. Massoud was a skilled guerrilla fighter who was respected by both his followers and his enemies. He believed that the resistance needed to be organized and disciplined in order to succeed, and he was known for his ability to coordinate attacks on Soviet targets. Tactics and strategies of the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen employed a range of tactics and strategies in their fight against the Soviet Union. They relied heavily on guerrilla tactics, using hit-and-run attacks and ambushes to harass Soviet troops and disrupt supply lines. They also relied on sabotage, using explosives and other weapons to destroy Soviet infrastructure and equipment. In addition to their military efforts, the Mujahideen also engaged in propaganda and outreach efforts to gain support from the Afghan people. They established schools, hospitals, and other social services in areas they controlled, in an effort to win over the hearts and minds of the population. International support for the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen received support from a range of international actors, including neighboring countries such as Pakistan and Iran, as well as the United States and other Western powers. Pakistan played a particularly important role, providing training, weapons, and safe havens for the Mujahideen. The United States also provided significant support to the Mujahideen through a program known as Operation Cyclone. Under this program, the U.S. provided weapons, training, and funding to the Mujahideen in an effort to bleed the Soviet Union dry in Afghanistan. Conclusion: the Mujahideen played a critical role in the resistance effort against the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. They employed a range of tactics and strategies to challenge Soviet control of the country, and they received significant international support in their efforts. However, the Mujahideen were far from a unified group, and their goals and ideologies often clashed. This internal division would ultimately contribute to the rise of more extreme groups, such as the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, in the years to come. Chapter 3: Urban Warfare and Atrocities. The Soviet Experience in Afghanistan. While the Soviet Union enjoyed early military successes in Afghanistan, they faced serious challenges from the Mujahideen's guerrilla tactics and fierce resistance. In this chapter, we will examine the challenges of urban warfare and counterinsurgency, as well as the allegations of atrocities committed by Soviet troops during the occupation. Urban warfare. As the conflict in Afghanistan dragged on, the Soviet Union faced new challenges in their efforts to maintain control of the country. One of the biggest challenges was urban warfare, as the Mujahideen began to shift their tactics from rural guerrilla warfare to urban combat. The Soviet military was not well equipped for urban warfare, and they often struggled to adapt to the new environment. The Mujahideen were able to take advantage of the crowded and complex urban terrain, using buildings and narrow streets to their advantage. This led to intense fighting in cities such as Kabul and Kandahar, with both sides suffering significant casualties. Counterinsurgency tactics. In response to the challenges of urban warfare, the Soviet Union employed a range of counterinsurgency tactics designed to root out Mujahideen fighters and sympathizers. These tactics included the use of informants, raids on suspected insurgent safe houses, and the establishment of checkpoints and roadblocks. While these tactics were sometimes effective in disrupting the Mujahideen's operations, they also had significant negative consequences. The use of informants led to distrust and fear among the Afghan population, while raids on civilian homes often resulted in the detention and torture of innocent people. Checkpoints and roadblocks caused significant disruption to the lives of ordinary Afghans, leading to resentment and anger towards the Soviet occupation. Allegations of atrocities. As the conflict in Afghanistan continued, reports began to emerge of atrocities committed by Soviet troops. These allegations included the indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas, the execution of prisoners, and the use of chemical weapons. While the full extent of these allegations remains unclear, there is no doubt that the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan was marked by significant violence and suffering. The conflict caused significant civilian casualties, and many Afghans were subjected to torture and abuse at the hands of Soviet troops. Conclusion: the Soviet experience in Afghanistan was marked by significant challenges and difficulties. The shift to urban warfare and the use of counterinsurgency tactics led to increased suffering and disruption for the Afghan people, while allegations of atrocities committed by Soviet troops further eroded support for the occupation. Chapter 4: International Intervention and Negotiation. Attempts to end the conflict. As the conflict in Afghanistan dragged on, various international actors attempted to broker a peace deal between the Soviet-backed Afghan government and the Mujahideen. In this chapter, we will explore the diplomatic efforts of the United Nations, neighboring countries, and other global powers, as well as the obstacles and setbacks they faced. United Nations efforts. The United Nations played a central role in the diplomatic efforts to end the conflict in Afghanistan. In 1980, the UN Security Council passed a resolution calling for the withdrawal of all foreign troops from the country. However, the Soviet Union vetoed the resolution, and the conflict continued. In 1988, the UN launched a new initiative to bring about peace in Afghanistan. This effort, known as the Geneva Accords, brought together representatives from Afghanistan, Pakistan, the United States, and the Soviet Union. The accords called for the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Afghanistan, as well as the establishment of a power-sharing government in Kabul. While the Geneva Accords were a significant step forward, they ultimately proved ineffective in bringing about an end to the conflict. The Soviet Union continued to support the Afghan government, and the Mujahideen refused to recognize the legitimacy of the government. Neighboring countries and regional powers. In addition to the United Nations, neighboring countries and regional powers also attempted to bring an end to the conflict in Afghanistan. Pakistan played a particularly important role, serving as a base of operations for the Mujahideen and providing significant support to the resistance effort. Other countries, such as Iran and Saudi Arabia, also provided support to the Mujahideen. However, their involvement in the conflict often reflected their own political and strategic interests, rather than a genuine desire to bring about peace in Afghanistan. Global powers. Finally, global powers such as the United States and the Soviet Union also attempted to end the conflict in Afghanistan. The United States, in particular, provided significant support to the Mujahideen through its Operation Cyclone program. The program provided the Mujahideen with weapons, training, and funding, with the goal of weakening the Soviet Union's position in Afghanistan. The Soviet Union, for its part, engaged in various negotiations with the Afghan government and the Mujahideen. However, these negotiations often broke down due to a lack of trust and a failure to reach consensus on key issues. Conclusion. Despite significant diplomatic efforts, the conflict in Afghanistan continued for years, causing significant suffering and disruption for the Afghan people. While the various international actors involved in the conflict had different goals and interests, there was a shared recognition of the need to bring about peace and stability in the country. Chapter 5: Legacy and Consequences. The lasting impact of the Soviet-Afghan conflict. The Soviet-Afghan conflict had far-reaching consequences for both Afghanistan and the Soviet Union. In this chapter, we will examine the long-term effects of the conflict on both countries, as well as the broader global impact of the conflict. Afghanistan. The conflict in Afghanistan had a profound and lasting impact on the country. The war had caused significant civilian casualties and displacement, and many parts of the country had been devastated by the fighting. In addition, the conflict had further destabilized the political situation in the country, paving the way for the rise of extremist groups such as the Taliban. The Taliban emerged in the early 1990s, in the aftermath of the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan. The group was initially seen as a stabilizing force, and many Afghans welcomed their efforts to bring order to the country. However, the Taliban's harsh interpretation of Islamic law, coupled with their repressive policies towards women and ethnic minorities, would ultimately lead to their downfall. The United States and its allies invaded Afghanistan in 2001, following the September 11 attacks. While the initial goal of the invasion was to root out al-Qaeda, the group responsible for the attacks, the conflict would ultimately become a broader effort to stabilize the country and prevent the resurgence of extremist groups. Soviet Union. The Soviet Union's involvement in Afghanistan had a significant impact on the country's internal politics and economy. The war had drained significant resources from the Soviet Union, contributing to the country's economic decline in the 1980s. In addition, the war had caused significant casualties and loss of life, leading to public disillusionment and opposition to the Soviet government. The conflict in Afghanistan also contributed to the decline of the Soviet Union's global influence. The war had damaged the Soviet Union's reputation as a superpower, and it had strained the country's relationships with other countries in the region. Ultimately, the Soviet Union would collapse in 1991, marking the end of the Cold War and the beginning of a new era in global politics. Global impact. The Soviet-Afghan conflict had a significant impact on global politics and security. The conflict had served as a battleground for the Cold War, with the Soviet Union and the United States providing significant support to opposing sides. The conflict had also contributed to the rise of extremist groups, such as Al-Qaeda, which would go on to launch attacks on the United States and its allies. The conflict in Afghanistan also highlighted the limitations of military intervention and the challenges of nation building. The United States and its allies would go on to engage in similar efforts in Iraq and other parts of the world, with mixed results. The legacy of the Soviet-Afghan conflict, therefore, continues to be felt in global politics today. Conclusion: the Soviet-Afghan conflict was a complex and challenging conflict, with far-reaching consequences for both Afghanistan and the Soviet Union. The conflict had caused significant suffering and displacement for the Afghan people, and it had contributed to the rise of extremist groups such as the Taliban. Thank you for watching our story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so you don't miss out on our next video.